Alhamdulillah, a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Just to clarify, is there anyone here who is not Muslim? Just, yeah, so welcome. I want you to feel, we all would, I can speak for everyone, I'm sure, want you to feel at home. And in situations like this, I try to use a language that's understandable for anyone, Muslim or non-Muslim. Since the majority of the people here are Muslim, I just want to let you all know I want to honor the fact that you may not know what we're saying when we say Alhamdulillah, etc., etc., etc. So Alhamdulillah means praise belongs to God, to Allah, and the Muslims say that lots. So anyway, I just want to make it clear that if you have any problems or if it's something that I say inadvertently that doesn't make sense, please feel free to say, what do you mean when you say Subhanallah or something? Please do, because it's good. It's a good reminder to myself that I want to speak more universally here if I can, inshallah. So we say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Compassionate. And a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. We seek refuge from shaitan. The shaitan is the one that splits and that separates one from oneself, separates people from each other, separates one from the truth. So we seek refuge in God from that energy that would separate us from truth and reality, wherever that might happen. So let me say a few things. I am also really pleased with the makeup of this audience, the group here. I think it's probably consistently the more healthcare people, professionals than I've ever seen in one group before. So that's going to make it real interesting. Could I say, if any of you feel comfortable with coming a bit closer, could any of you? Is that all right? So that we can draw together, and the tradition is that the more closely you draw together, the more that Allah, bestows His rahmah on us. For those of you who were at my lecture last night, one of the things I stressed and discussed a lot was this connectedness. So the closer you draw together, the more of Allah's mercy, His rahmah, is present by that closeness. It's something to remember when you have a car and it's too crowded. That in New Mexico we do this. I've seen it so many times where you pull one more person in, knowing that if you have to squeeze together, there will be more mercy from God present in that setting. This is not sort of romantic idealism. This is truth. Okay? And a lot of the things that come to us in Islam, that we use as guidance in Islamic medicine, that come from the Prophet Muhammad, it's important to remember that a lot of the hadith, we tend to think of things as being metaphorical and symbolic sometimes, but it's important to remember that many of those things that we think of as being metaphorical actually are much more so and very real, and they sometimes take deeper examination to understand what that's about. And I'll give some examples of that. So my own biography is this. I grew up in Southern California, Manhattan Beach, California, surfing USA. I grew up surfing. All my family, that's their history. I think it was one of the gifts that Allah gave me, that I could spend every day at the beach for maybe 14 years as I grew up there. Summer, winter, would be year-round often, barefoot in the sand, and with the ocean spread out in front of me and the ocean of civilization behind me. And so I think I benefited greatly from that experience. But there was a wasteland otherwise, spiritually speaking, in Southern California. I called it a wasteland. And my means of survival in that setting was to turn to art and music. and plunged myself very deeply into fine art, painting, sculpture, et cetera, and then went to Berkeley and spent the entire 60s in Berkeley studying art and getting involved in theater, music, drama. And so I wasn't really connected to medicine until after I left Berkeley, went to England, and there was a Muslim Sufi sheikh who said, Hakim, I wasn't called Hakim then, he said, you should do medicine. And I was surprised and I thought, really? You know, but as he said that, I knew that he somehow understood that I had been interested in medicine from when I was 5 or 6 years old, and that I discovered in a garage in a house my parents had an old encyclopedia. Bernard McFadden, has anyone ever heard of Bernard McFadden? Bernard McFadden was one of the so-called nuts among the berries, kind of one of the eccentric American health kind of fanatics. And he did this enormous thing called the Encyclopedia of Natural Health, Bernard McFadden. He's one of these people who at 65 was like, you know, working out and, you know, kind of like Kellogg and some of these other a little bit slightly kooky people. But Bernard McFadden was very sensible, and he had this Encyclopedia of Natural Medicine. And as a child, I discovered that, and it became my books. And I used to go through those, and that was my first introduction. Later on, when I was 13 in Southern California, people were interested in television and watching television. Disneyland was being constructed, and my interest was in being more active and doing things more interesting than sitting in front of a television and watching I Love Lucy. So I had a hard time convincing my family to do that, but one of the things I used to do at that time, when I was 13, is I used to go out and I found some books that were about plants and herbs, and I was so fascinated with the fact that you could go out and that you could actually eat what we considered weeds. And so I would collect weeds and various natural plants growing and try to make salads and try to get my family to eat them. They wouldn't do it, of course, but it was my introduction. So, and later on, anyone know a book called Stalking the Wild Asparagus? So these are all kind of books that have been influential in my life and that I'm referring to, Bernard McFadden. Stalking Wild Asparagus is a book by a man named Yul Gibbons. And curiously enough, he, at the age of 13, also went out and collected wild asparagus, which I did. I collected wild asparagus, tried to feed it to my family. And he did the same thing, but he wrote a series of books on the kind of foods that are out there that we don't ordinarily think of as foods, that you can forage and find, that we often consider weeds. So, you know, I've had a history of being interested in plants, medicine, the body. I studied the body when I was very young, physiology when I was very young, because I was a very skinny, weak little kid and kind of felt intimidated by strong people and bigger people, and so I sort of made a point of learning about that. I was very scientifically inclined, used to love the library, and so I made a point at an early age, about 13, 14, studying the muscles and physiology and learning how the body worked. And I was kind of like I was pretty rebellious in a certain sense, and I wanted to prove that I could, as a very skinny, small person, become maybe something more than you would expect. So I learned how to shot put, and I became a weightlifter, Olympic weightlifter. I was part of an association of Olympic weightlifters, and I was very skinny, but the reason, and what I did at that time is I learned really, in shot put, for example, I learned something that many athletes learn, is how to make the body more efficient, or how to make more use of the entire body. So the shot putter, when he shot puts, and I'm mentioning this because it'll come up later, when the shot putter shot puts, really, he begins from his toes. And that push moves from his toes up his legs through his entire body. It moves from the upper part of the body, turning, and every bit of his being goes into throwing that shot put. So I wanted to prove to people that even though I was maybe 105 pounds or something like that I could throw the shot put further than, you know, someone who was 200 pounds. And so it was a kind of challenge I had. But it's something that, you know, played into my understanding of what happens in this extraordinary thing we call the body. and what it played into my understanding of what integration and integrity in the body means. I have a cat that I've learned a great deal from. My cat Jopi. Is one of my closest friends. And Jopi, I had a loft that was about 7 feet high. Jopi leaped from the floor. I don't know if any of you have cats that do this. Jopi, he was just, this high. She leaps in one bound from the floor to the 7 foot. And I looked at that and I thought, wow, high jumpers do all this sort of study of the body and how to move just right. The same thing I was doing with the shot put. I thought, look, how does she do that? And so part of my understanding in studying that and understanding how she does that is part of what I want to try to impart to and remind all of us about today, and that is to do with the integrity of the body and what health, being whole, is about. Health comes from the word holth, and it means whole. It means being whole. So there I am. I studied fine arts, music. I got involved in street theater, ritual theater in Berkeley. That was my approach and my response to the political activity that was going on there. Took the artistic approach, did ritual theater that involved the entire community, theater in which the community took part. I was not a Muslim at that time, but we studied to create that theater. We studied all of the world's religions. And at that time, studying all the world's religions, one of them happened to be Islam. And for those of you who become Muslims or understand this, when you study all the many different religions, you see that Islam is extremely rich and exceptional. So that's inevitably what led me into becoming Muslim, much to a lot of my artistic friends' kind of surprise, and they thought I'd gone crazy. But in any case, I became Muslim and I went to England and started visiting North Africa and Morocco on a regular basis, and that's when I met a sheikh who said, you should do medicine. And I thought, what, me do medicine? Why should I do medicine? But from the time he told me that, from that day on, people started coming to my door and saying, Hakim, I've got this problem and that problem. And I say to them, well, did you go to the doctor? And they say, yeah, I went to the doctor and they did this. And I, oh, okay, well, let's see what we can do. So, by Allah, I was sort of pushed into it, but I discovered at that time too that I loved the study of medicine. I loved the study of the body. I loved the study of plants. I loved the study of nature, and I loved all of that. And as for those of you who have taken this tack, what a delight it is to learn these things and to learn all of the pieces that are involved in a really holistic approach to medicine. The awesome reality, the awesome beauty of the human body and how it works. That alone is something that, with reflection, enables an extremely powerful spiritual experience. Yes or no? It's true, isn't it? I mean, I so often, over and over in my lectures and classes, and for my own self, I marvel at the very fact that we have this vestibular mechanism that enables us to keep from falling over. That's not a little thing. And not only do we have it, so that constantly I'm reiterating my own state of being and presence to my environment, relation to the ground, my body weight, but not only do we have that, but we can become graceful with it. I can twirl on one toe and so forth. I could do very, very subtle gestures with my hand that communicate to you various things. I marvel at that. I marvel at the fact that I had a little bit to eat. I marvel at the fact that the process of digesting and transmuting that food into myself, the energy that generates should cook my own flesh. It should. The acids, the things that are involved, but it doesn't because my cooling system is so efficient. I marvel not only at that, but at the creation around me that is created and is as awesome and as beautifully designed as this. And this is one of the basic principles that I learned from my teacher in Pakistan, Hakim Ahmed. And that is basically, it's also something that one of the great Sufi sheikhs said. He said, man is a little universe, and the universe is the big man. And whatever you find inward in this system, you will find outward in that system. Whatever you find in gatheredness in your own being, you will find outwardly in the creation, the universe in separation, not one hair more or one hair less. And to learn about this, you can go out there, and to learn about that, you can go in here. So my teacher said, I learned medicine from my grandfather who taught me in the forest. So on one hand, it's purely metaphorical. On one hand, everything that we experience in creation is metaphor, one for another. One part for another part. In one sense, it's all metaphor. In the Quran, it says, in yourself and on the horizon, there are signs for those who reflect. So this reflection is a key piece of being alive. It's not just a key piece of learning and understanding. When I first started studying medicine, one of the wonderful things I discovered, because I was very enthusiastic and very inspired about my newly discovered Islam and the spiritual practices that were there. And what I used to do at that time, when I was told I should do medicine, what I used to do, I had at my fingertips, I had these beautiful libraries in London, Wellcome Institute. Does anybody know the Wellcome Institute? Anybody here? Wellcome Institute is this great medical library. I mean, it's floor upon floor upon floor. And not just modern texts, but, from England, old texts. I mean, you could find anything there, journals and old books. It's an incredible place. So not only did I have those libraries at hand that were in London, but I had this inspired feeling of being a Muslim and having this connection with God, with Allah. So what I used to do is I used to pray, and as I was learning myself and looking for teachers and reading, I would take any question that came to me, I would pray, I would make dua, I would say, Allah, what is the meaning of such and such? And there were answers that would come immediately. So a great deal of my learning then was really from inspiration. And one of the things I want to reiterate through the day here is point out, people talk about traditional Islamic medicine, and how do we recover the kind of glory of that era and that time? I want to point out and emphasize this idea that these people, the Muslims that created algebra, that discovered they discovered Ibn Sina, all of these people, the science and the art and the understanding and the knowledge that came forth from them, they didn't just sort of get it on a platter from someplace. It's something that grew out of, one, their connection to their practices and their religion, their deen. It came from the purification of themselves, but it came forth from them in terms of understanding. And so people talk about, well, how do we as Muslims, again, regain that? And it's not by going back to that history and that tradition. It's by transforming ourselves and by us becoming so whole, so complete, and so fulfilled that it flows out from us. Okay? So I want to emphasize that and re-emphasize that. That's not a little thing. So, okay, there I am in England, Morocco, starting to learn medicine. My first teacher turned out to be a homeopath that treated me for my chronic asthma and cured me permanently of my chronic asthma. That was a good lesson right off the bat for me, because I saw, well, here's a chronic problem that I'd had all my life and that people have, and they best work at palliation, but the homeopaths have a deep, permanent cure for it. And philosophy surrounding, and a philosophy and principles understanding what it's about that enable that to happen. So my first teacher he was actually a druid. He was an arch-druid in London. John DeMonte was his name, and he treated me of asthma, and I said, well, could you teach me about homeopathy? So he became my first teacher, and I apprenticed to him one-on-one. And I've been fortunate in my in my time studying medicine to have this opportunity to actually, almost all of my training has been one-on-one from individuals. So John DeMonte was the first person I learned from, a homeopath. There was another homeopath in London that I spent time with. There was the Hakim that I met in Pakistan after a lot of searching and a lot of difficulty that I spent time with. And he said he taught, I was invited to Pakistan by Hakim Muhammad Saeed. Some of you know his name. He was one of the most famous Hakims, traditional Hakims in the world. He used to speak for the World Health Organization. And he was primarily a businessman that created Hamdard Foundation, which produces medicines. Where's our pharmacist? Hamdard. Do you know Hamdard? Hamdard is very big in India and Pakistan, but Hamdard is one of the few places in the world today that manufactures on a large scale traditional medicines. I mean, there are also Chinese, right? There's a lot of Chinese companies that manufacture, mass produce medications too. So Hakim Saeed invited me to Pakistan, but he was not a teacher. He was primarily a politician and a businessman. So I had a hard time, very difficult time in Pakistan. Very difficult time in Pakistan. I usually get smiles from the Pakistanis when I say that because they know what I'm talking about. Karachi is one of the most difficult places in the world. And after about 3 months of being there, I was ready to, I was tearing my hair out, ready to flee. But I made dua, I made prayer to Allah. I asked Allah, please show me, because everywhere I went, I found Hakims that were not, to me, they didn't really have knowledge. They said, well, what we have is secret. We keep it just within our family. They said, well, if you want to learn this, you're going to have to learn Urdu or Farsi. If you want to learn this, or they didn't want to let go of the family secrets, or it really seemed like what I found in most cases was a lot of people who really didn't know anything, to be honest, and who were in kind of a business setup where they had a good deal going and they didn't want to let go of it. And I was pretty disappointed because I was looking for this traditional knowledge that was intimately linked with Islam. And I thought, well, there must be a medicine, because I had learned at that point in England, before I started practicing medicine and studying, I had learned that so-called Western medicine had its roots in that same tradition that came from the Hakims. Are all of you familiar with that? Do people know that? That many of the Greek writings and much of the Greek medicine actually came through the Arabs and through the Hakims to what was the foundation for modern Western medicine. I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the sort of history picture. So, am I getting too disjointed here? Are you with me? So here I am in Pakistan, and I ask Allah, please, please, please. And so I was so frustrated that I had gone to all these Hakims, and I thought, well, this is a bust. It's just not going to happen. And so one day I thought, okay, today, inshallah, I'm going to go out, I'm going to find a teacher, and I couldn't find. So I was in the middle of Karachi, and I went to this dawakhana. Dawakhana is where they dispense the medicines. I went to a dawakhana, and I thought, well, if nothing else, I haven't found a teacher, so I'll just stay at this dawakhana and just watch what happens here. I'll just be here and see people come and get the medicines, and maybe I'll get something from that. So I just stayed there. And I explained to them, look, I just want to observe what's going on here. And I talked to one of the people that worked there, and it was mostly Urdu. And then the man said, I told him why I was there, and he said, oh, so you're interested in learning medicine? And he said, yeah, I told him my story and why I was there, and he went away, and then he came back and he said, my brother is upstairs. He's Hakim, he'd like to talk to you. Would you like to speak with him? And so I went up and I met him, and his name was Taqiyuddin. And he said, I learned from my grandfather, who taught me in the forest, and his grandfather was Nizamuddin from Ajmer in India. And he said, when someone comes to you and they're sincere as a student, he said, you must teach them. If you want to sustain and have any access to knowledge yourself, you must teach them, and you must teach them as much as they need for absolutely nothing. So he said, if you're interested, can you be here tomorrow at 7? I said, absolutely. So I started, and it was like maybe the fourth, fifth day I got there at 3 minutes after 7. Every day I was there at 7, and about 4 or 5 days later I got there at 3 minutes after 7, and he said, you know, I don't feel like teaching today, so you come back tomorrow. So I got the message really quickly. I had to be there at 7 every day, but he gave me as much time as I wanted. We were one day in his apartment so long that we didn't realize, we were going through his grandfather's notebooks, and he was translating from Urdu to me, and I was making notes, and we were studying like that. One day we were there so long that we didn't realize that it had been raining an inch an hour outside. And when we finished the day of teaching, I went outside, and people were not walking up and down the streets of Sadr. They were paddling their boats and they were swimming. There was a flood. It was this enormous flood. So, alhamdulillah. And his family was an interesting tradition. His family came from a tradition of Rajasthanis who were historically soldiers. And one of his great-grandfathers was a military person. He and his fathers and in their family, that's all they had done, was they were warriors, fighting all the time. And this man, one day, he was a very special person, obviously. He left his sort of palace and gone out on his horse, and he was riding, and on a hill above him, there was an old man making wudu, ablution with water, and he was making his wudu. This is one of our terms. Wudu is our ablutions. We wash hands, face, before praying. He was making his wudu, and the water was coming down the side of the hill and splashed on this man, and he was enraged, ran up the hill on his horse and ran over the man with his horse, and then rode off and went back to his castle sort of place, his whatever. And then he had deep remorse. Like, why did I do that? And he had such remorse, he personally decided he would get up and go and find this man. Went and found the man, picked him up, took him back, and then kept his servants away and said, no, I will take care of this man. And nursed his wounds, took care of him. And the man said, this was by Allah. And it's because you are not meant to be a soldier anymore. You're meant to be a Hakim. And so you are my student now. And that was his student. It was the shift in that family from being warriors. But they always retained some of their warrior spirit, which I think was a pretty healthy thing. So that's kind of history. And then, I was fortunate when I came back to America after that study. I met a medical doctor who was a mainstream medicine from UCLA, MD, and I opened a practice with him in Santa Barbara. And he said, I will teach you mainstream medicine, physical diagnosis, modern disease entities, understanding, et cetera, et cetera. He said, it's really easy. He insisted on it being really easy. And we had a clinic there for about 6 years and a family practice. And in that family practice, the reason we opened a clinic there was because I treated him homeopathically. And we started seeing clients privately. And he saw the results of homeopathy and was so pleased, he insisted that we open a clinic, the two of us together. So he is another one of the people I was fortunate enough to apprentice to for 6 years, and to learn actually physical diagnosis, maybe in a little more detail than they learn in medical school nowadays, which is, it's gone downhill. Physical diagnosis, that is palpation, a lot of the stuff that they used to do, and they rely on technology and equipment nowadays to use to do. So I had a family. In that period of time, we treated just about everything that came to us, infectious disease of all kinds, pneumonias, staph infections, and we almost never used antibiotics. And in cases where I would get to a point where I'd be using homeopathic remedies and herbal things, I'd say, I think we need to come in with antibiotics. It's a child with high fever and pneumonia. And I'd say, I think the remedy's not working. And he said, no, let's try one more remedy. So he would push a little more than I would. And that was a very unusual situation. But as a result, we used antibiotics. I mean, I could count on my fingers the times we even had to resort to antibiotics. So that was a very fortunate time for me. And so homeopathy has been one of my primary modes of therapy. because it really does work and it's remarkable stuff, along with everything else that I'm going to talk about today. So more recently I've gotten into trauma therapy, and when I was saying earlier that the things that come to us from the Prophet Muhammad, we tend to, sometimes we think of it as being things that are metaphorical, or we take it as meaning, not maybe as literal. But one of the things he said, after being in homeopathic practice for maybe 25, almost 30 years, there was a sort of a typical profile I would see, and this would be, here's a typical picture. Usually a woman, sometimes mid, but more often a woman, abused severely as a child, usually sexually abused as a child, and emotionally very, very troubled. Sometimes physically very hypersensitive, extremely hypersensitive physically, what they call environmentally sensitive. Almost all of those people, as some of you may know, were abused as children. That's one of the pieces that play into their pathology. So these people, I would give them homeopathic remedies, I'd give them counsel. Sometimes they would be involved in spiritual practices, and still they were suffering. Still they were victims. Still they were drawing trauma to themselves. Still they were not fulfilled in their life, and it didn't seem fair to me. And I thought, Ya Allah, oh God, there must be a healing for these people. It's not fair that they were victims as children, they were victims as teenagers, they're victims in their 20s, and they're still victims again because they can't find their way out of this dilemma that they've been put into or they find themselves in. So I prayed I said, Allah, show me where this, where the healing, like I did when I first started studying medicine. And I tell you, when you want to know something and you don't find it in the books or from your teachers and from your friends, ask the source of all knowledge directly. Don't forget that. And so, I discovered at that time by a series of clear signs, synchronous events, I was led to discover this particular therapy, trauma therapy. It's based on the work of Peter Levine. Anybody know Peter Levine? Waking the Tiger. In the book, in the things you have there, I have a book list. And it was very difficult for me to make decisions on what I'd put on that book list, but that's one of the books on that list, Waking the Tiger. And there's a short little article by him in there. It's an alternative method, somatic method. Are you from when I say somatic, do people understand what I mean by that? Yes, no? Some do. The new wave in therapy for emotional problems is somatic. That is dealing with the emotional problem with the physical body, the neurology and the physical body. And we'll talk more about that today, how that works. But it's an important piece, and especially for people who have an Islamic point of view, it's an important missing piece in the understanding of how you engage in therapy other than simply with talk or with catharsis or revisiting problems historically. Does that make you all understand what I mean by that? So I prayed to God. I said, show me where this therapy is. And it became clear. I found a therapist, and I did some work with him, and I said, this is what I was asking Allah for. And this has been my history. My own personal history has been, when I wanted to become, before I became Muslim, I'd studied many religions. I'd gone through all sorts of things in Berkeley. I'd gotten to a point where I felt very fulfilled and happy with my life, and I thought, what a wonderful thing life is, and how generous God has been. But there's something missing. What is it I didn't know? And I said, God, so I used to pray. I was a singer and a musician at that time, and I used to sing my prayer. So that was the method. So I used to, go out on my own, or sometimes in public I'd sing spontaneous prayers, but I used to go out in private and sing my prayers, but I'd sing it, oh God, show, and so I was, for 1 week I was saying, oh God, forgive me for not being satisfied with all that you've given me. Forgive me for not being satisfied, but, please show me what this thing is that I feel is missing. And what it was that I was missing was something more dynamic and full and intense in terms of the actual acts of worship. And I somehow knew that inside because I was doing ritual theater where we would kind of reenact and recreate ritual that we could engage in as a community and engage the community in doing these. But we were making them up. We were taking them from this tradition, that tradition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was very beautiful and very powerful. So I prayed this, and then I went back to Berkeley, and I met a man. At that time, I was interested in Sufism, and I said to the man, I'm interested in Sufism, and he said, forget Sufism. He said, there's no Sufism, there's Islam. This is what Islam is. I mean, he was a Sufi too, and that was it. And he said, well, this is what Islam is, and I said, well, that's what I've been praying for. So for me, Dawah took about a half an hour. It was a half hour of this man saying, this is what Islam is, and I said, that's it. What do I do? And at that time, being in Berkeley at that time, he said, well, go take a shower right now. And I ran up I was living in a house full of artists and painters and poets, and so I ran up to the bathroom to take a shower, and I opened the bathroom door, and there's 3 people in the bathtub together, and I said, I've got to take a... They said, come on in. I said, no. This won't work. So I managed to get them out of the bathroom and got the thing that turned the water on. And then someone pounds on the door and says, water's pouring out, there's a leak. So I had to turn the water off. So I realized, okay, something's conspiring against me doing this, so I've got to make it happen. So I got a pan of water to do my angles of width. So but the point I'm making here is that I asked Allah and I got a response. And I want to reiterate that when you need something and when you want to know something, so often I've been with people and they say, well, all we can do now is pray. No, it doesn't work. I tell you, it's better to turn that upside down. Pray first for whatever it is you want. Go to the source. I've had patients who are not Muslim. And one of the prescriptions I've given many people when they have a dilemma, I tell them to get up before dawn, sit, be aware of God's creation, be aware of you, just be present, and then ask reality, God, whatever term you want to use, ask for guidance. And it's interesting because I had a patient one time she kept getting help better and better. I was treating her homeopathically. I'm going off on some tangents here, but I'll bring them back together if you have patience here, inshallah. I had a patient one time who she was getting healthier and healthier physically, and then she was working on her emotional health. And one day she started saying to me, she said, I really appreciated the homeopathic treatment. I feel really well, but I feel the need now for some spiritual practice in my life. Same place I was at, wanting more intense engagement in that activity, worshipful activity. And being a Muslim and being her physician, I didn't feel, it wasn't correct to say, well, check out Islam. I'm a Muslim. She knew I was a Muslim. So I said to her, well, get up at dawn. And I gave her this prescription. And then I didn't see her for about 3 months. And then I ran into her on the street and she was wearing hijab. And she told me that she got up at dawn and she asked God. And she said that day she went out and she met these people. She said everywhere she went, she got this message about Islam. And she said, this must be the one that I'm looking for. So I didn't have to personally do it. So I just want to reiterate it. So back to my story, this personality, this profile of the person who's been abused, repeatedly abused, and still is suffering. Homeopathy does not help. In psychotherapy for 12 years, reiterating the same issues. And as she puts it, I just saw my therapist today and I'm a wreck. So many issues have come up and I'm going through so much right now. And I'd see year after year and she wouldn't make any improvement and no response on the homeopathy and not really able to guide her to any spiritual practices other than what she was already in. So praying to God. And so I was given an insight myself to this therapy I mentioned. Waking the Tiger happened to be the particular one. Somatic therapy. And I went and I did some work with a man who became my first teacher. And I realized that I was looking for healing for the trauma for these people, but I realized at that time that I also had discovered and found the healing for my own trauma. And so this brought me back to what I was saying, that when we hear the hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, there's a saying in which he said, when you make a dua, when you pray for someone else, when you make a dua for someone, the angels pray with you because you're asking for someone, not for yourself. The angels pray with you, and when the prayer is finished, they say, and Allah, God, give to the one who is asking that what she is asking for the people. And so this was like a twist. I suddenly had this insight, well, wait a minute, this is another meaning of that hadith, that I was praying for someone that their trauma should be healed, but I had the gift of discovering that also my own trauma was to be healed. And I had this extraordinary discovery that I was traumatized. I didn't realize it. And from that point, I realized, as I began to study this particular thing, realized the degree and the extent to which we are all traumatized, individually and collectively, and how important that is. And that then in turn immediately plays into what I learned as a Hakim, which is we must understand, one, what our nature is, what health is about, and achieve some perspective on where we stand realistically. And I don't believe we've done that for the most part in the age in which we live. So is this a stopping time? And when do we? We'll keep going. Let me see how this. Let's go to 12:15, but let me break it at there, and let me open up and try to get some interaction. I don't want to just yak all day, and I hope I won't be, because I want to be able to communicate from my being to you what I feel is valuable and maybe important. But let's have some interaction. Yes.
Can you be more specific when you say that you realize we've all been traumatized?
Yeah, I'll go into that more today, but here, let me put it in a nutshell. If you study the symptoms of trauma, which is a pretty newly developed field in terms of understanding the specifics and the details. Trauma was not an area of study, not even a term that was really understood until recently. And actually one of the real influences on recognizing that there is such a thing as, we began to understand something called post-traumatic stress from the Vietnam vets. That was influential. But the women's movement actually had a big influence on understanding particularly the kind of trauma I'm talking about, childhood trauma. So if you examine the symptoms of trauma in an individual, there are particular, they're very specific. And you find that collectively to be true. One of the most obvious ones that you see is when a person has been repeatedly traumatized, the reactions to trauma and stress basically are, we understand that the autonomic nervous, the reptilian level of our being responds in various particular ways. Fight, flight, and freeze. We learn that in biology, right? People tend to remember fight and flight, but people tend to kind of leave freeze out for some reason. I don't know why they've that one's not, I think maybe because most people are frozen. So what you see, what I believe is happening right now, individually and collectively, is the third picture. Basically, dissociation is the way that manifests. Just not being present. And that's it's a strategy for survival. It's too much. It's too much to recognize that your neighbors are ready to kill each other, or they're doing it, every other night. They're ready to murder each other. It's too much to realize that the children, I won't say the kids or the young people, the children that live around the corner have guns. It's too much to realize what's happening, how many people are being put into prison. It's too much to realize that what's happening in Iraq. It's too much to realize what's happening in Africa. It's too much to take it in. It's overwhelming. So one of the ways we deal with it, to survive with it, is to shut down. turn on Friends, turn on the television. Here is a fact, and this is not a little fact. We all need to take this in. For the one who reflects, Quran says, in yourself and on the horizon there are signs for the one who reflects. The one who reflects is the nature of a real, awake, concerned, responsible human being. It's the way of a Muslim. We must reflect on these things authentically and appropriately. Here's something. What is the largest growth industry in the world? What is the largest growth industry in the world? More money than the arms. Drugs. Illicit drugs. Not legal drugs. Illicit drugs. That means heroin and cocaine primarily. The largest growth industry in the world. What does that say? Oh yeah, it means blah, 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 blah. Let's, time to go to work. You know what I mean? We do not take in what that means. It is not a good sign. So that's what I'm saying in a nutshell. Individually, we withdraw, we dissociate, we disconnect. We turn to drugs, we turn to television, we turn to eating, we turn to anything that keeps us from being present and facing both ourselves and our own circumstances and the circumstances of what's around us. But it's a very serious, that's an illness to do that to an extreme. I mean, we need to do it for survival. There's a degree of denial that is healthy, right? Any psychologists, therapists in here? No? People who've studied psychology. I mean, we live in an age in which psychology has become an intimate part of the general narrative, the popular narrative. I mean, yes. I mean, to a great degree. I mean, they make movies now about pretty deep psychological concepts. And actually, they're pretty accurate in some cases. More or less. They have the Hollywood edge on them and so forth. Yes?
Can you explain briefly the terms flight, freeze?
Fight, flight, and freeze. Yeah. Well, there's a concept of the reptilian brain, right? The mammalian brain, and the neocortex. And in the reptilian brain, we have the autonomic nervous system. We have the basic survival instincts. Now, in the modern trauma theory, it's believed that trauma that is not healed is stored in the memory on that level, on the very, very basic level. So it's an unconscious, very survival-oriented level. That mechanism in our being, when we're faced with threat, the means for survival, one way to deal with that threat is fight, strike out, protection, flight, to run away from it, and freeze. That is, the animal, I don't know if you've ever seen, has anyone ever seen a possum play possum? Or a groundhog? Or actually, other animals do it as well. Many animals. And actually, they go into physiological states that are remarkable, where everything shuts down. And so the animal that's pursuing them thinks they're dead. They lose interest. And in the study of this trauma work, we study animals in the Waking the Tiger approach. A lot of it has come out of studying animals in nature. So, in the course of training, you see a lot of videos where it's remarkable what happens. The freeze. So the freeze mechanism, the freeze state is one way. In other words, when you shut everything down, you're not threatened because you're not there. At least that's the experience that you have. The whole day will be inclined to go to these questions and answers, and my inclination is also to get to that whole issue, because actually this is at the forefront of what a lot of the work I've done for many years has led to, which is understanding the nature of this concept of trauma and the release and healing of this trauma. So yeah, we'll be jumping ahead a little bit, inevitably, but let's get back to it. So let's go to this traditional the practices of traditional. I think one of the most important things to realize is that the traditional medicine, one is that there's been an enormous break from the traditional medicines that really probably can be marked by the Industrial Revolution and the changes that came about at that time. And I tend to want to say now the industrial techno revolution, because following the Industrial Revolution comes modern technology, which is another pretty big jump in terms of lifestyle and many other things. Before the day's out, I want to try to talk about really the implications of how we live within a technological society that we overlook. The implications that has for the nervous system, the implications that has for our sense of being. The reason I bring that up in terms of traditional medicine is that the traditional models of medicine were earth-based and earth-connected in their principles and in their model worldview. So we have what's called Islamic medicine that really there was no Islamic medicine. The only Islamic medicine that existed at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was the medicine of his presence and his being and his customs and traditions that established themselves, but that had an enormous influence on the health of the people around them. What I was saying last night is that all of the prophets brought not just a spiritual healing, but a physical healing as well. They brought models, or they brought, depending upon who they were, they brought guidance that would reaffirm a prophet that had come before them and the guidance that they'd given in terms of how we live our life, and the model and the manner in which we live our life being the means by which we achieve physical health as well as emotional, spiritual, social, and political health. Wholeness, harmony. So the Prophet Muhammad, by his very presence, inspired people. He inspired people. Last night I was pointing out to someone, we were talking about touch, and one man came to the Prophet Muhammad, or he said, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said to one man, he said, go to such and such a country and take the teachings of Islam with you and spread it to the people there. And he said, can I do that? I don't have the capabilities of doing that. And he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, he went to the man and he put his hand on his heart like this. Excuse me. He did this and he said, can you not do this? And the man said, yes, I can do this. And they say, well, not only it was because of the touch that gave him the sense of, right, yes, I'm here with this man who's touched personally. That's beautiful, isn't it? It's very beautiful. Not only can I do, but some people say actually that he transmitted by his touch the ability to do that. So he inspired people around him. And this is not a little thing. This is a very big thing. So let me stay with, I want to jump to all these other topics about inspiration and how important that is. But those people at that time, they were very connected to elementals. They were very much people with their feet on the ground. Literally. Literally, they had their feet on the ground. They had animals around them. They were connected to the earth, and they viewed the world in terms of very simple elements: earth and heavens. When they said water, there was no atomic theory, there were no table of elements, there was no fragmented science that came with this modern era. They were not trained in it year after year after year to think in terms of that. They were trained to think in terms of, this is the ground that I dug in with my hands as a child, that I get my feet dirty with today, that if I fall, I hit and it hurts, it's hard, my body's heavy on it, and that's the heavens that I look up and tonight and imagine, how can it go forever and ever and ever and ever? Right? They experienced the samawati wal ard, the heaven and earth. They experienced it. They lived within it. The Quran says, in yourself and on the horizon, in yourselves and on the horizon, there are signs. Signs, ayahs. Ayah, the word ayah means sign. And we are ayatullahs. We are signs of Allah. And we are the ayahs on the horizon. We are, as Rumi put it, the poet Rumi, we are the ones with our feet on the ground and our heads in the heavens. But something happened. Historically, academically. And it found its way into the modern world. And it's a science and it's a religion of belief and pattern and language of the unseen. How many of you have seen an atom? How many of you carried an atom around in your hand? Huh? No, I mean, and experientially saw the atom and carried it and felt the weight of it? No. The point, you understand the point I'm making. So those people were earth-based people. They were people who thought of things in terms of, at that time, the medicine of the prophet that came up was to do with his lifestyle. It's to do with his generosity. It was to do with what he taught people about eating very little. It had to do with him saying, this is good food, this is a good thing to eat. Honey is good. Milk. He quaffed milk. I want to make that point right now. Through the day, I'm an advocate for whole milk. It is one of the best and healthiest things you can drink, unless you don't have the enzymes to manage it. And you have an illness, which is the inability to digest it. Okay? The Prophet ﷺ, he drank water in sips, right? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. He would only take a small sip and then he'd say Bismillah between, in fact. But he quaffed milk. So, his example, he taught people by example. And that was a medicine. The biggest medicine was eating very little. All traditional medicines, Hippocrates says, his single statement, Hippocrates says if there's one thing, Hippocrates' single statement about good health, eat little, drink little. This is traditional. All the traditional medicines take that point of view. Okay? So, the medicine that came from the Prophet had to do with his teaching. It had to do with Quran. Quran itself was a medicine, and the sound of the Quran alone healed people of their physical ailments. But it healed their hearts and brought inspiration to their being, which then in turn drove their physiology, purified their physiology, opened their circulation, awakened their nervous systems. Right? So that medicine was part and parcel of what he brought, peace be upon him, as a whole. But then, if what immediately, not soon after that took place, was the Muslims, the Prophet Muhammad, one very important statement that I reiterate, one of his hadith, hadith is a saying of the Prophet Muhammad. You're taking in a lot more than everybody else I know. And forgive me for not translating at all times. But one of his sayings was, hikmah, which means wisdom. This is what this class is about, hikmah. What is hikmah? What is wisdom? What is this knowledge that's called hikmah that came to be applied to the practice of medicine historically by the Muslims? The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, hikmah is the lost riding beast of the believer, of the mu'min. And when the Muslim says believer, the word mu'min, it comes from the root of the word amina. It means one who trusts in the nature of reality. So when I was praying to God before I was a Muslim, I was saying, oh God, please forgive me for wanting more. But there is something more I want. And that to take that stance, to believe that he was generous to me, that was a kind of amina, kind of trust. I believe that, although I'd had very difficult times and I'd seen very awful things happen around me, I believe that basically the nature of reality was that it's a good thing. I trusted in the goodness and the mercy of God in spite of the difficulties. That's amina, to trust in that. And so the Prophet Muhammad said, hikmah wisdom is the lost riding beast. A lot of people don't understand what's meant by this. The lost riding beast of the mu'min, the believer. When we say lost riding beast, it's like finding a horse that you grew up with. It's your horse. And it's been lost and you find it. Right? And you say, I have a friend who had a horse whose name was Kismet. Before he was Muslim, as a kid. And as a Muslim, when he was doing trauma therapy, he had this experience in which his horse came to it. He was doing the trauma therapy and going through the process, and he said, I see my horse Kismet. And the horse Kismet came to him and showed him as a horse how to release this trauma physically. So he began mimicking what the horse did for him. But in any case, that's a little sidetrack, but it's a beautiful... So he said the hikmah is the lost riding beast of the mu'min, and he has a right to it wherever he may find it. So if you find your horse in the woods in China, it's still your horse. You have a right to it. Get on it and ride it. So based on that, what the Muslims did historically was they took the medicine of the Greeks. And that's what's known as Unani medicine. But it became the foundational principles for what the Muslims taught, and the foundations for what became known as hikmah. But it was Greek medicine taken from Hippocrates, Galen, Jalinus, and the Greek physicians. And the Greek medicine, I don't know if any of you have studied Greek medicine. Greek medicine was very, very sophisticated and very evolved. And it wasn't just Hippocrates and Galen. There were other schools that were very, very advanced. Soranus was an incredible, his school, the school of Soranus, believed in not using any medicines at all, but only using natural means to enable a person to navigate through the illness, understanding that the illness was a gift and a benefit, and that by actually going through the illness, your body would gain strength by going through all the symptoms, but they would use hot, cold, wet, and dry. They'd use these methods to keep the person balanced enough to make it through the illness. And Soranus even had in some of his texts descriptions and methods for taking a person through rabies. It's pretty interesting. So they took from the Greeks. They took from the Greeks part and parcel, because the Greeks afforded with the basic principles that they found in their Islam and the Muslim teachings, which is, in the Quran it says, Allah created the heavens and the earth. Samawati wal ard. Heavens and earth. The basic dyad. The endless unbounded space, the solid fixed earth. And then within that, then air and water. So the four elements from the Greeks fit the Muslim understanding of the creation. But it's important to remember this, that at that time people lived in that realm. They were not trained to think in terms of molecules and atoms and calcium and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the things that we have, that we work with now, that actually inform not only our science and our therapy and our approach to science, but they inform our very being. Do you understand what I'm saying here? We have a particular attitude about what we are and who we are based on that information that's been fed to us year after year after year. Just as that person who had an understanding of earth, air, fire, and water as being the basic elements from which everything is made up had. So they had a particular point of view. And I would say in many cases it may have been an advantage to them to have that connectedness, because it enabled them to connect with themselves experientially in the terms and sense of being. Okay? You with me on that? I know some of you are. Being as opposed to living in an abstracted concept of what we are, separate from the experience of being what we are. So that became the medicine of the Muslims, and then they began to elaborate on it. Galen, Jalinus, the Greek, Avicenna, Ibn Sina took from him and elaborated and added to what he had presented. I have a recipe that came down from Hakim to Hakim to Hakim. I have a recipe that was given from my teacher that came from Jalinus, from Galen. And it's actually a liver remedy. It's got about 100 ingredients. So that was the tradition. But all of this went out the door. All of this went out the door, dramatically out the door, with the advent of the modern world. So much so, I learned pharmacy in Pakistan. That is, I learned to make pills by hand. By hand, each one. Do you know? And I used to do that. When I'd work with my teacher in the morning, in the afternoon I'd go down to the dawakhana, and then I'd learn to grind. In particular remedies, you learn to use different mortars and pestles. Sometimes you use a marble mortar and pestle, sometimes glass, sometimes iron, sometimes wood, sometimes jade. And depending on what medicine you're making, the understanding, the subtle aspects were so sophisticated that to make a particular remedy, you may use a circular, right? You may do this. But it's very specific for each medicine and each remedy. So it went out the door dramatically. And the traditional understanding that came with Greek medicine, that is of the four humors, earth, air, fire, and water, and then the four humors of the body, that was the tradition that informed modern Western medicine, including the medicine here in America, up until how many years ago? How many years ago were people talking about humors? 75? Maybe 75 years ago, 100 years ago. I'm losing track of that now. You have to keep adding on to these numbers, don't you? So in our language, those traditions, so the Greeks, let's get back before I talk about the language. So are you all familiar with the concept of the four humors? Anybody not familiar with the concept of the four humors? Okay. The Greeks based their medicine on the idea that the blood in particular, I mean the body fluids are one thing, but in the blood you could find four distinct aspects of the blood. And those distinct aspects were described as being earth, air, fire, and water, or the four humors. Phlegm, which is primarily the water element, or balgam, safra, which is the bile, the fiery element, yellow in color, balgam, white in color, dam, which is blood, the red blood element, and sauda, which is the heavy, combusted bile, which becomes heavy like sediment, and the heaviest part of the body, which is of the blood, which is the earth element. So have I covered all four there? Earth, air, fire, and water. Blood is red. Dam, it's the pardon me? So there's blood is the red element. That's the red blood. And that element that corresponds to air. It's warm and moist. To air. Air is warm and moist in the nature in this schema. Dam is sauda. It's black. It's your heavy earth element. The word in English is melancholy, and that was the word that's brought over into our modern language. We still use the term melancholy, right, to some degree. I mean, it's becoming less and less, but melon means black, chole means bile. Black bile was the combusted heavy bile, that if you have an excess of it, is the earth element pulls you down and creates a depressed sense, depressed experience. So in the traditional model of the humors, too much black bile causes melancholy. I mean, it is melancholy itself, literally. Good humor, a person has good humor, right? You know this expression, that still is in our language. That means they have the good humor, which is the red blood. They say that the Prophet had an excess of the good humor of blood. And in fact, he, peace be upon him, used to let the blood, which was in excess from this vein in his finger in the springtime. So he would bleed himself in the springtime to release that excess blood, because he had an excess of that particular element. That element corresponds to air, to youth, to springtime. The emotional qualities that are connected to it are joy, happiness, good nature. Each one of these elements has an emotional relation, a season, and a balance of elements, earth, air, fire, and water. So have I covered all of them? I could have done a scheme. This is a handout I should have done. I'm sorry I didn't. But, practically speaking, it may be hard for you to make use of this. People say to me, I'd like to learn the four-element theory. And I say, well, you're going to have to work at it. Because part of what you have to do is you have to learn how to extricate yourself from this other training that is embedded in you, which disables you from seeing things elementally. But there is a value in it. There is a value in beginning to understand and recognize things in terms of elements. So we have earth, air, fire, and water. Those are the four elements we want to try to understand. Those do. Rumi, in one of his poems, said, he made statement something to the effect of, here I am bound by the four walls of those elements. In other words, what he was saying was every experience he had could be defined and described in terms of earth, air, fire, or water. So, in this setting, I am more fiery than you are because you're sitting passively. What sits passively? Elementally? Earth and water. So the earth and water is a strong element here. What is movement and active? Fire. Exactly. So this is a way of understanding things elementally. I flew here on the plane. Big chunk of earth, right? Big earth chunk, metal, tons, right? So how do you move earth from its natural location, which is down here, boom, to the realm of fire? How do you move it from that realm? How do you do that? What do you need to balance that, to take it from earth into the realm of fire? What? And what else? A lot of fire, called jet fuel. You need a lot of fire to lift that up, right? So this is a way of looking and understanding things elementally. It's not our norm. We do not think and live in this way. But there is a benefit in it because it relates to your physical body. People who are earth-based people, I would suggest, were more connected. Back to what the theme I stressed last night, this idea of connectedness. They were more connected to their own bodies. They were more connected to the earth. They were more connected to God in their worship and time that they spent with worshipful acts and practices and recognition. But here's something else. You'll find that earth-based people also have, now people talk about transcendence as a kind of goal. You will find earth-based people, that is people who are connected with the earth elements and live in that realm, they have access to what I would call extraordinary experience more easily than people who live in abstracted realms. This is something you don't always find, because people who work with quote-unquote spiritual realities, they try to emphasize getting high, transcending, rising above. This is what's above. Thought, abstract thought, concept. It's fiery, celestial, samawati. But you go to any place where people are very connected to the earth, who birth their children with the smell of the sound of birds and animals around and play music and have drums, and there's few people like that still left on this planet, although they're disappearing very fast, as opposed to a hospital with its sterile fluorescent lights and smells of chemicals and plastic tables and disconnected people. You go to those people who are earth-connected people and earth-based people, and I tell you, wallahi, by Allah, they have extraordinary experience. They see and experience things from the unseen, energies. They see them in experience. They live in it. It's a secret that I think it's something we often overlook, is that by being more present in the condition in which we've been placed by Allah, by being more in that place, we have access to Allah's greater creation. Not by transcending it abstractly and creating in our imagination these experiences, but by really physically experiencing them. Are you with me on this? This is an important little piece, and you'll find a lot of people who don't really take this tack. They really take the idea of trying to get high, trying to move to the celestial experience, to the abstracted experience, to the fiery place, and not find it by the means in which their sensory realities are connected to the experience. Okay. So really with the germ theory and the modern medicine and technology, all of this went very, very rapidly out the window. And then even more recently, what's gone out the window is because of the constraint of schedule, time, our lifestyle has become dramatically out of balance. I mean, we all say that we know that, but I don't think we really begin to recognize the implications and the impact that has. We are not able to successfully be objective or clear enough to see that driving to and from work is crazy. We don't believe that. We're not capable. I'm jumping out there being extreme, because I know people say, well, it's crazy, but I like my car. I've got a nice car. You've got a nice car. And that's one way of managing it. Yeah. Well, how do I deal with this crazy thing of driving to and from work? I get a nice car that I can really appreciate. But give me a break. It doesn't compare to a beautiful Arabian with a hand-tooled saddle. It doesn't compare to a beautiful handmade robe with a turban sitting on. I mean, we're not able to find the perspective that gives us clarity about what's happening here. There's a book called Pattern Language. Anybody into architecture? Know architecture? There's a book called Pattern Language, which is a very good book. I don't know whether I'd recommend it's worth. I didn't put it on the book list. I considered it. I don't know whether it's worth buying unless you're really a book fan or you like to read. This is by an architect in Berkeley, and it's a book very big, thick book, and it's about lifestyles and patterns of, it's called a pattern language, and it's about how we live, how we build a house, how we build houses next to each other, how we design communities, how we design cities, or don't design them, how they happen, and the implications of all that. And it's made up a series of bold print aphorisms, so to speak, and then long discussions of them, and then another aphorism. And one of the aphorisms in there is, he says, and when I first got the book, I opened it to that aphorism, and I was so impressed. I reflected. Again, this thing of, don't take things for granted, reflect, examine what's happening as much as you can. He said, anytime a person works in a place separate from where they live, there's an irrevocable split in their being. I thought, whoa, what? Wait a minute. What does he say? Really? This guy's a, architect from Berkeley, well-established, mainstream, but that was the statement. And then he went on to explain it and discuss it. And I understand it at this point, what that means. We don't understand that. How many of you get what that means? Yes? An irrevocable split in our being. Our home and our work are into, and what's in between? What's in between? In the case of where we came from, what was it? Well, how many lanes? 13 lanes of asphalt. 13 lanes of asphalt, and how many minutes of posture like this in a encapsulated environment? That's between And that punctuates and informs. So our being is affected by it. Hello? And people's response when I say this is, well, what am I going to do? Change? I can't change that. I'm not saying we should change it. I'm not saying we should go to the forest. I live in the mountains and I cut my own wood in the forest with a chainsaw. I'd rather do it by hand, but I do use a chainsaw. But then I cut it up, I carry it myself, I burn the wood, I heat myself with wood that I've cut from the trees, and I speak to the trees as I go out there. I have a luxurious option that many of you here don't. So I'm not saying we need to move to the forest, but we need to recognize is that our nature? Is it our nature to be in the automobile that much of the time? Is it in our nature to live the way in which we do? Is it in our nature, and does it benefit us to live in a controlled temperature environment? It's comfortable, but I tell you, there are times when it is not beneficial to us. Not in terms of our body having the ability to naturally respond and react to temperature change. Not in the ability for the natural circadian rhythms. Do you know circadian rhythms? Anybody? The circadian rhythms of the body to respond to the sun rising, going across the sky and setting. Alhamdulillah, praise be to Allah, that we as Muslims still are expected to connect to this concept of the sun rising, being above and setting, and even the direction of it by our qibla, by the direction in which we pray. I mean, of course, some of us have left even that and preferred a little chart that's on the wall. Or if we live in the city, we don't have much choice. We don't know what time of day it is. But the body likes to know it. The body has natural harmonics that delight in the circadian patterns, the daily patterns of day and night. So that medicine, the traditional medicines that were earth-based, Chinese medicine, elements. Ayurvedic medicine, elements. Right? Greek medicine, Arab medicine, hikmah, 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And then, so in those days, traditionally, people were able to see and understand things in terms of hot, cold, wet and dry, earth, air, fire, and water. And in many books, many classical texts, you'll find descriptions of what this is about. Even in the 1001 Nights, there's little lessons in this, you know this, huh? There's even in the 1001 Nights, there's little lessons in earth, air, fire, and water, in the elements. And there was an understanding of the foods that were hot and cold and wet and dry. And there was an understanding of the conditions that were hot, cold, wet, and dry. I had been going to see my teacher every morning at 7 a.m. on the dot, and we were translating day after day from his grandfather's notebooks in Urdu. He was reading. He was translating to me. I was writing in the notes in English. And one day I showed up there and he said, "You know, Hakim," or Abdul Khabir, he called me Abdul Khabir. I wasn't known as Hakim then. He said, "I think your brain is getting too dry. Here, this is your lesson for today." It was a book of stories of Pushkin. Pushkin short story. Anybody know Pushkin's short stories? Alexander Pushkin. They're little short stories. They're remarkable in the kind of like these. They're all stories that have to do with these extraordinary circumstances, where all these things happen, and at the end, it all kind of ties together, and you realize, that's what makes it. It's very beautiful. They're very delightful. But he said, your brain is getting too dry. You need something fluid instead of just data to balance that. And it was a lesson for me. So even more dramatic than is what has happened with the industrial techno revolution is now we're going to add another, we'll keep adding industrial techno, and I want to put another slash and put corporate as the next piece, because the corporate world and that reality as an entity has also been dramatically influential in terms of shaping the way our lives are lived. I have a friend who just wrote a book, a really close friend in Chimayo. I live in the mountains of New Mexico near a little town called Chimayo. And she just wrote a book, and it's called Chiva. Anybody know what Chiva means? You know Chiva? Chiva is a street name for heroin, a Hispanic street name for heroin. And the subtitle of the book is called A Village Takes on the Global Heroin Trade. And the book is about, one, the heroin addicts, and one particular heroin addict lived in this area that we're in, Chimayo. But what she did in this book was brilliant. She jumped from that person and his personal experience to the global realities of the largest growth industry in the world, right? The governments, all of the governments of the world, and all the banking and all the corporate implications in all this, and how that implications of those large corporations have an impact on this one man here in the mountains of Chimayo. So the corporate world, again, this next more modern piece more recent piece has a big impact on a lot of what we learn in these institutions. Hello. The ones I give an example, is the soybean. I still don't know where we all stand, how we stand together on the soybean thing. But the soy industry and the influence they've had in terms of creating scientific studies that prove the value of soy and soy products. Or the water. The one that the most, maybe more glaring one is the thing of water, the 8 ounces of, 8 glasses of 8 ounces a day. And how that really, and there's actually a mainstream, it's not an alternative person, it's a mainstream physician who is considered pretty much a solid scientific expert on hydration of the body, and he wrote an article about that, about how that was really promoted by the people that sell water in those little bottles. Excuse me. So I eat little and I drink little, and if I drink water, I drink it the way the Prophet ﷺ drank it, which is a sip at a time, because it really takes some effort it shouldn't be chug-a-lugged. So these corporations have influenced the legal industry, the whole world, corporate world. I have a friend who was a physician who quit being a physician because he said, I can't practice medicine because the legal parameters have forced me from doing so. And he didn't mean just in the level of insurance, and he didn't just mean that. He meant that he said, he was in a hospital, and he said, if a patient comes to me and I think I can all they need is just water, and I don't give them the antibiotics, I don't give them what was mandated for liability, he said, I won't have a job. So it's the legal industry that's also delineating his medical practice, or his practice as a healer. So that's the last piece of it. We can talk more about that. The friends I have who are in mainstream medicine are more vociferous critics of their own system than I am. And like I said, when I was working with the MD in Santa Barbara, I'd say, let's go with the antibiotics. And he'd say, no. So much time, let's try one more remedy. And my friend who's he's a cardiologist in California, if you took him out of the context of being a cardiologist and listened to what he had to say about the practice of medicine, and he's one of the leading cardiologists in the country, he'd sound much more radical than the alternative medicine practitioner. So we'll go into that some more. So are we ready is this time to take a break?